Welcome to All About APIs. On this podcast, you'll hear from seasoned API practitioners, product leaders, and architects on what it takes to successfully design, launch, and maintain APIs that unlock new growth opportunities. Hello and welcome, everyone. This is the All About APIs podcast. I'm your host, Buddha, product evangelist here at Tyke. Over the course of the season, we have been discussing all things API-led product growth. We have looked at different aspects, different areas of this particular topic. And today, we're going to be looking at what API-led product growth means for the financial services industry, especially FinTech, and some of the lessons learned from diving into the world of API-led growth in this specific vertical. With me today to enlighten us on this very topic is Daniil. A big grand welcome to you, Daniil. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me. Exciting.
Awesome. Let's get started then. Perhaps, Daniil, you could give us a little bit of your background. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your experience, and what your journey in the world of APIs has been so far.
Sure. I've always been on kind of a bit of a hybrid, not a classically trained engineer, but I was always kind of technical through high school, university. Got a degree in economics out of university, and then started two startups right out of the university. One was in financial news sentiment detection, and then other one was in social media space, like more retail app. Both obviously, unfortunately, didn't pan out, but that's where I really picked up a lot of that API by building them, consuming them, and working a lot. That led me to getting a role as a pre-sales engineer in a it was at that point not yet a fintech, but in a financial services company, being kind of the first hire into essentially demoing and selling the APIs. And then because I was one of the first people to care about APIs, I kind of became the de facto product manager. So really been straddling, initially started a more technical front. Then went more to the product side of the house. And then, pre-sales was always nice because you're always talking to customers. So being a product manager and pre-sales simultaneously was a nice thing. End up growing the teams in pre-sales side, on the product side. Left that organization last year, and now I lead API North America for Kyriba, leading a number of API products, both consuming and kind of outwards facing.
Great. Been quite the journey then. Tell us a little bit about your recent experience, especially when we talk about the financial services industry or the fintech industry. How did you get started? What was your sort of initial impressions of that particular industry? And how did you see organizations or people sort of utilizing APIs in that particular space?
As I mentioned in my little intro, that when I joined, the company was financial services. It was not a fintech. But, about 2015, around that time, a bit earlier, a bit later for some of the companies, a lot of the companies started really turning the corner on it. So it's been, a massive shift. I think during COVID, there was a crazy stat, even how further it went in the past couple of years, was that, only after the biggest API benefactor of COVID was in sheer volume was medical space, and the second one was financial, because so many processes just became more automated. So I think, it's been growing for a number of years, and it's keep growing right now. Now there's API first companies in fintech space, but there's still crazy amount of growth. So I think it's just depending where the companies in the journey, where the industries in the journey. Some industries in financial and fintech are much closer to the customer. They may be very well into their journey. Some of the larger organizations may be slow in their journey, but it's been a constant huge growth, I think, in different aspects from data to execution for the entire time I've been involved.
You bring up a really interesting point there, where I think terminologies, again, I'm a big fan of this clarification in terms of terminologies, because I've seen people using financial services and fintech almost interchangeably. In some cases, there are obviously different stakeholders in the industry itself. You've got your fintechs, you've got the banks, and there is financial services overall coming in. So perhaps just for the folks who are new to this area, could you tell us a little bit about what is the difference? What is financial services? What do you mean by fintech? What role does a bank play in all of this?
Yeah, so financial services really any company that it's very very loosely right that deals with in financial space. It could be capital markets, could be advice. It's a pretty broad. Depends who you ask. You can have completely different parts of the industry never talking to each other, right? But it's anything to do with money movement and recognition of money. So that could be not just execution, but also services around it, like taxes, stuff like that, in a way. Uh, I think the big difference between banks and fintechs is that some of the um, lines are being slowly erased is the licensing, right? So a fintech has to use a bank essentially, because there are some notable exceptions, especially with crypto, but fundamentally you cannot hold money without a bank. That's really what the license of the bank has. So most fintechs actually use a bank, and most banks are trying to use some technologies. So there's very nice symbiosis, right? I think a number of years ago, there was a lot of articles and saying, "Oh, fintechs are going to crush banks and stuff like that." In reality, it's a symbiosis. It's not something you have one without the other. Banks have the regulation and the licensing to hold the money in a protected way, and then the fintechs have the agility to execute. Right, so it's really a very nice kind of industry play where there's a lot of M&A activity. Some fintechs are trying to become banks, but it's really it's an ecosystem rather than in a purely competitive environment.
They are solving very different problems and they have their own skill sets. So absolutely, definitely an ecosystem. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Which brings us to obviously the main theme of today, which is around API-led product growth. So we've seen what the ecosystem looks like. We've seen how APIs sort of started coming in and what sort of benefit that's brought in. But when we talk about API-led product growth, it tends to mean different things for different people. Different verticals obviously think about it very differently. You've got, in some cases, it is purely a revenue play. In some cases, it is building out new products, different segments, different user groups. So just bringing that in, is that also true for, say, the fintech industry or maybe the financial services industry at large? Or would you say there's a different perspective to API-led product growth here?
Yeah, so I think there's all that is true, but as we previously mentioned, there's so much differences in what products and who you're trying to serve, right? So I think it really depends on a number of parameters, including size. Region is also potentially plays a role, but I think even if we start at some major ones, is like what space are you in, B2B or B2C? That obviously has a very big impact. Other component would be, especially from how product-led growth is happening, what they should focus on is size of organization versus the age of organization, right? Just because it's a big organization, if they went through hyper growth, it could be enormous. Doesn't mean they're old, and some of the older organizations may have some bigger problems and a legacy. And what I mean by that, so like in a big organization, having API-led growth is presents a number of problems that are actually less, in my opinion, are less technical. If you have a small startup or a smaller company with 50, 100 people where every engineer knows each other and they know everything, you don't, API governance is not a big of a topic. However, in a larger organization, I think API-led growth, I think at that point, especially if it's a technical product in nature, then you may have amazing APIs, amazing engineers working on it, but the governance becomes such a critical component of it, where discoverability of it, making sure it's standardized, making sure it's usable altogether, right? That I think really becomes a big concern, and something needs to be solved. So you probably already solved the technical component. You have the top of the line on a technical level, but you need that coordination that sometimes is unfortunately solved through human aspect of it, and the best way usually is through more automated way, through having good governance. And I think that's one of the bigger concerns on the bigger side of the organizations, being part of a few of those conversations. While if you kind of also add the dimension of time, I think the API-led component runs against the legacy issues. You have the monolithic. Some organizations still have mainframes. They're just big monolithic chunks of code that nobody knows what it does. And then obviously API-led growth kind of bumps into that, because you're trying to have a roadmap, but then you have these large chunks of code that you basically are not allowed to touch. And how do you control your delivery with there's these massive things you just basically cannot touch, or if you touch, it's 6-month delay, right? So that's the other component, is like you have to manage properly, and it's less of a technical thing. I think it's more of a good product sense of piecemealing the functionality in such a way that you can still deliver value and have that product-led API growth while still, unless you're getting that approval to replace the whole monolith, which is very rarely happens, just being honest with yourself and being, okay, we're going to be focusing on this specific functionality and it's going to deliver this specific value while there's still monolith, instead of trying to boil the ocean and trying to change a core process of the organization that's has no interest in doing so.
Absolutely. I think you bring out a very interesting point there, because we've seen this as well when it comes to, just having conversations with folks who are trying to implement this in different industries as well. It's not just limited to FinTech, but it's also about, it's a process. Like you say, it's a process, a shift in mindset. It's a shift in process and the shift in how you're going to be approaching the problem. A lot of times people think about API-led product growth and that's where they want to get started. But on further inspection, they would probably look at, okay, actually your infrastructure right now is really not built to be able to get you to that point where you actually want to be. Now, like you say, you probably don't have to have a ground up revamp of everything, but there is probably an opportunity there to phase it out in such a way where you've got the first stage, which is really getting your core infrastructure right. Maybe that is going to be through an API management platform. Maybe there is going to be some other tooling that is going to help you get there so that, like you say, you've got more visibility over just the APIs that you own right now. Having the security that is going to form that foundation, trying to speak the same language first before you can start, creating that next step in your journey, which is where API-led product growth comes in. So absolutely agree with you on that. So you touched upon API governance as well. And I think that, again, leads us into the world of, say, standardization. So, and again, FinTech and other regulated industries, for instance, there is a lot of conversations around open standards, or open banking and PSD2 being two of the more popular ones around. So what is sort of your take on that? Do you think open standards good, not so good, needs to be changed? Are they working? Are they not working? What's your sort of stance on your opinion on the world of open standards in accelerating some of this stuff to get moving?
Well, obviously, it's a great step forward. There's still a lot to do. I think it's not we're there. Like PSD2, as you mentioned, is a European one, and it's very, even though technical standards are actually very non-technical, which is probably a good thing. It's very much a rule change, almost like a legal change. Who's allowed to touch the data, and it really forced the banks that didn't have API programs to say, you have to have an API program. We don't care how you do it, but this is the data that should be available and to whom. So I think that was very important. But interesting thing about PSD2 is that it's basically but it's heavily retail oriented, right? So it doesn't really affect corporate clients. It has some effects, but a lot of it is indirect. So open banking it's very regional right now. So in Europe, yes, but also very segmented, where only certain types of API traffic is subject to it. While it's also being worked on in Canada and US, but it's not out there yet. So there's a number of standards that are applying to different areas. I do think is generally creating pressure on the banks, even if it's a B2C regulation. The B2B components usually larger banks, obviously have both sides of the business, but they're kind of looking at it. Okay, this is coming, or might as well do it. But there's just, I have this theory that the B2C always affects B2B financial services, because it doesn't matter if you're a CFO of a large corporate and you're a B2B user, you're still a B2C when you're sending money to your son, whoever, daughter, wife, whatever, right? Venmo or some sort of transaction. So there's always that pressure of especially user experience, where I've seen definitely in B2B payments where, a CFO will be asking you questions like, why is it so easy to send $100, but it's so hard to send $10 million, right? And they just couldn't understand, like, I'm paying you so much money. Why is one so much harder than the other, right? Or so much worse. So I think there's also part of that experience driving on the client side, where people are seeing the certain experiences, like, well, I want that for my corporate or SME. So yeah, it's overall good, but I think it's still a long way ahead. And at some point, there'll probably be some conflict between standards with some deconfliction of it. But yeah, it's really, we're still fairly early in the journey.
I think like you sort of touched upon this as well, where there is a technical component of it, which is sort of a driver behind that standardization. Like you want to have different systems speaking the same language, being able to communicate with each other, driving that value, which is kind of the overall objective, is to be able to do that, especially when you're working with legacy systems or banks. It's kind of forcing them a little bit to move forward a little bit more so that fintechs can actually utilize that data, provide that value that they are built for to their consumers, but they can't really do that if they're trying to work with multiple banks speaking multiple different languages, or in this case, trying to formulate or create their APIs in so many different ways. So I think the overall objective is appropriate, where the standardization is going to bring these systems a lot closer. It's going to make life easier in terms of integration. So that's the technical component. Obviously, there is the business side of things as well, where you're really trying to look at what kind of value drivers are going to be brought into this mix as well. So I think there'll be a couple of different conversations to be had, and there is an evolution. I'm sure I'm with you on that, where I think there's going to be an evolution to all of this.
Just to add to it, but also the technical component, I think, is, to be frank, is, we're talking about APIs, but that's almost the easier part of it, because it's not that hard to do a CRUD API on a process, right? But making sure that process and standardized across, let's say, 5, 10, 100 banks, right? It's much easier than making sure that that process internally standardized, so it's following, the data refresh is actually, real time and not just every 4 hours with the API wrapped around it with a delay. Like making sure that the actual business experience is standardized and following certain expectations is much, much harder. And that, I think that's what's driving, is that it has certain, time-based components of the technical, like it's very legal language, but there's certain, process-oriented components, which then building API around is much simpler. So that, if it's slightly different variation, are you using camel case or you're using underscore, right? It becomes, that's maybe a pain to map it, but that's a much smaller problem to solve than a completely different process across the 10 banks.
Definitely. I think predictability is one of the key drivers as well here, where, again, you're trying to make sure that things are repeatable, things are A, understandable, and then B, you can trust that whatever calls that you're making, whatever integrations that you're doing is working today and hopefully will continue to do so. And if you were to try and repeat the same process across different systems, then you don't have to keep customizing and making those changes, and therefore driving that efficiency associated with it. One thing, again, with you touched upon conventions as well, in terms of, how do you want to standardize processes internally? There is an internal driver to all of this as well, but there is equally a risk averseness that comes with API-led product growth in a lot of industries, and probably more so in financial services too, where you have a lot of people who are a little bit hesitant to even adopt APIs to begin with, and then exposing those APIs for external users can be a problematic thing for a lot of people, at least in their own minds. So do you see that as a trend coming in across the board? How do you sort of navigate some of those challenges when it comes to managing risks and getting people on board with the journey like this?
Yeah, I think API is definitely people have become very risk averse around it sometimes, when especially it's a non-technical product, where financial services, they're not technical. They're very technical maybe in the financial modeling side of the house, so they can be very mathematically inclined. However, they could completely not be aware of the technology component of it. And when you're saying, oh, people are going to have access to this and it's going to be out there, you're like, oh my God, we can't have it out there. It's like, no, it's secure. But so it's like, there is, I think just because, API is secure, it's not obvious to a lot of the user business people, because API, depending on what your end product is, if your core product is not technical, which actually most products are not, right? There's a lot of business people, leaders in organization who probably have loose understanding of what an API is, and they probably are familiar with it by now, but what is their comfort level, right? So that's something you have to consider. So when you're talking about, it's all open and it's all, I think just saying open and free available would be very scary when you're, a financial leader, which you're used to very, secure. And just because it's open, it doesn't mean it's not secure, but the terminology could be very confusing and cause that risk a knee-jerk reaction.
Definitely. And I think a lot of people also believe that in terms of, just driving value, why would we want to give away things for free? And I think I was having this conversation as well. And it's like, no, we want to keep this within our system. We want to have these things hidden behind firewalls. We don't want to expose everything out there. And I think that's where that sort of mindset shift is very, very important in an API first landscape that we are definitely moving towards, or maybe we are already there. So absolutely. Which brings me to that step of, if an organization is looking to get started on their journey of, say, API-led product growth, they are probably much further away. They're probably not there yet at the moment. Their infrastructure is not quite there. So what would you suggest for an organization like that to, your aspiration is to be able to get to API-led product growth, where you are getting and driving value for your end users and customers and potentially generating some form of revenue on your end. But how do you get started? How do you take that first step? What is that first step?
Well, first step, you definitely need to have the right people. I think having the right people that know what good looks like is extremely important. And yeah, definitely there is war for talent and stuff like that. There's definitely that, but people is definitely most important component that have either done it or have a very good understanding what good looks like in this case, right? But some of the things that I think are critical, maybe some of them are maybe less there's a first step, but you absolutely need to have a stable demo or sandbox with good data, right? It's very hard to regardless of what your product is, entertainment, fintech, medical, right? It's very hard to have a meaningful API in the market that somebody's going to go product like growth, somebody's going to go check it out and do something with, if your sandbox is either not working, doesn't have even remotely closed data, or it's behind so many security things that nobody can access it ever, right? So I think if you don't have that, that's going to be very hard to do anything API product led, because nobody's going to be able to do anything. The other component of the thing is, don't forget to communicate with the rest of the business, especially as I mentioned, if the core product is non-technical. It's very easy to have a very elegant API solution that's very high speed. It's great, but the business doesn't understand what the hell the point of it is. And constant communication of, if you're a technical product, that's fine because most organization understands. However, if you're in financial space or medical or entertainment or manufacturing, it's you need to tie it back to the business value of why you're doing that whole thing. There's probably a very good reason, but do not forget the reason why you're building APIs. Building APIs for the sake of building APIs is not going to go far. And then the last piece, probably not the first thing to do, but something I would say, not probably the second, but we touched on it, is API governance. If you're trying to scale the organization, I think that's absolutely critical. Not having it, back in it earlier on, maybe that was less important, but now with we know so much about it. With so many good practices, having good API governance would definitely help you avoid a lot of problems down the line.
Yeah, and one of the points that you brought out here was really trying to communicate the impact and the value, I think, and that can be the key driver and the key thing that wins people's trust. Because a lot of times in large organizations, you'll see that there are experiments run, they're not going all in yet, but you're sort of experimenting with something that you think is going to help you innovate or get to that next step of the journey. And to be able to convince the others, and not everyone is convinced at the beginning, of course. You've got a small team of people who are probably convinced and they are going after this. And what is going to convince the people to actually put in those resources would be the data to back up all of the hypothesis that has gone into it. And I think that's kind of a really, really key driver for making sure that you're tracking the right things, which obviously brings me now to the next aspect here, where a key area of API-led product growth also is around the metrics, the things that you're looking to track, the things that you want to be monitoring, things that is going to help you make that decision for, whether to continue or discontinue the things that you're doing. So for the fintech industry, what would you say some of those metrics are? What should be measured? What should be sort of a priority when you're setting up some of these systems to actually help you make those decisions?
I think it's very product dependent, right? Are you just a data product, right? That is around data, right? All right. So then the simple way of doing it, is volume, right? How many API calls? That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. That's always a starting point. However, if you're in data business, are you just providing volume data? Then you could just charge by megabyte, right? You could say, hey, for megabyte, every 100 megabytes, I'm going to charge you X. However, I think with a lot of the insights we're doing, data products are, can be priced in a lot of more innovative ways, right? So look at tying it back to what business value you're doing. Charging by megabyte is not really business value. I mean, it may be simple, but maybe it's per insight. So it doesn't matter if they used 100 megabytes of your data versus 1 megabyte or even less, right? But if how many insights they were able to generate, maybe for example with machine learning, all this stuff, it's there's data component of flowing it, but there's also like, what are you getting back, the outflow of it, right? So that's one component of it is tying it back to the business value, not just charging for the technical components. It's very easy to do it in an API telemetry way, right? Traffic, volume, whatever, right? So that's on the data side, but there's other components to it where if it's execution, right? You can be charging for going back to the insight for generation of some sort of a process, right? That it could be done in 5 calls or it could be done in 10 calls. It potentially might not matter. If it generates a process, it could be charging for process. In payments, that's you're charging execution of payment. If it's other things, it's so I think it needs to be tied back on what are you doing and how do we align it? Because as a starting point, it's always good to know how many API calls you're doing, but depending on your product, you do want to have a good understanding. Does that correlate to what my business value is and what the customer is buying? Because if you have disjointed cost and revenue structure, then that if everything is going well and is going crazy, great, but there could be some divergence that create issues. So then you're really digging in and understanding, what does that post do, and why does the customer care about it, not just counting your gets and the puts.
Yes, and I think that's where the sort of combination of multiple kind of metrics, like you mentioned, come in so handy. Where as an organization, you might be tracking a lot of different things, and it could be on a lot of different levels, but essentially trying to put all of that in the context of maybe the jobs to be done, which is important for the organization, perhaps the value drivers and what they are, what kind of problems they are solving, what are the metrics that's going to help that business succeed, what are the things that you should be doing more of, and what are the things that you should not be doing more of. Whether you're going to be looking at the combination of your user metrics or combination of your business metrics, combination of your infrastructure metrics, all pooled in and all put together to tell that story that is going to help you say, are you doing the right things? Should you continue in the trajectory that you've sort of endeavored along? Or should you be changing track? Or should you be, diversifying a little bit more? Should you be doing something different because what you're doing right now is probably not working? So absolutely critical to have that kind of visibility. Absolutely critical to know what kind of outcomes, what kind of outcomes you're expecting, as well as B, to be able to track against those target outcomes, what is actually the reality. And I think that will help organizations understand a little bit more about, okay, if something is not working right now, what kind of tools do we need to actually make that possible? If there is no visibility, then perhaps an API management tool could help out, maybe a monitoring tool could help out, a logging system could help you out do that. But ultimately, it'll come down to the human component, because tools will always be enablers. It'll come down to how are you using that data? How are you using those tools to be able to make those decisions, to be able to drive those decisions? So
to add to it, actually, to expand on that. Yeah, I think the important component with API monitoring is also experimentation aspect, right? Is I've seen this maybe because of the products I was working on, but often the use cases can be, I talk about APIs as a bit of a Lego, right? You can build different products, and sometimes your clients can come up with things you haven't even conceived of or thought of in any way. So it's hard to imagine with a lot of other products, right? When you buy a car, you're going to go from point A to point B, but then it's like somebody buys a car, disassembles it, makes a windmill out of it. And you're like, why is there a windmill? Why is it, shouldn't be, like, you can see things like that don't make sense to you, but to the client, it can make total sense out of it, right? So I think you also want to factor in your metrics that just because it's looks different or actually looks very similar, but you might not understand it. Just having the tolerance for experimentation, not on your side, but on the client, and then supporting the clients with it. Because just because you think they're abusing your API volumes, it actually might be a very good reason. It's like, hey, actually, maybe we should increase the volume because that is a great use case. Maybe they increase the volume of getting the data. And so I think it's allowing the experimentation and being inquisitive and working with the clients. But to do that, to spot it, you need to have good tooling and the right kind of mentality and organization to say, hey, like, that's an interesting use case we haven't thought of. Let's explore it, support it, do whatever. And then it could create a new product. I've also seen that. That's a completely different product. Like I've had those where API-led product was literally led to a brand new, almost financial instrument. It was more of a technical instrument that really came from the clients that, can you do this, this, and this? And in this sequence, we're like, yes, like perfect, package it. And it's like, how does that make sense? And you see it and they're like, oh, that's a whole new product that we're going to focus on. So yeah, I think that experimentation, being tolerant to experimentation and having the tooling for it is very important.
Completely agree with you. I think there's a very interesting story around user research. I think we've got our user research team, and I think a lot of times when we actually go on those user research interviews, quite often we would see that, okay, our intention with our product is there is a hypothesis around that, where we've done our research. We're not just flying blind. We've done our research. We have looked at some of the data, what we believe we've heard from users and customers, and we've built out a product. However, there will be those sort of cases, like you mentioned, where it might be used in a completely different way. And that's kind of the interesting one. Even though perhaps the users that we are probably interacting with, they might be telling us that they want it in a certain way, but they might be the actual actions might say completely different. So I think that being able to observe some of that behavior, to be able to be mindful of that behavior is also going to be very, very important, to be able to perhaps track some of it, but equally just having that open communication, open feedback, I think is going to be very, very important, given that we are talking on an iterative cycle of transformation where you're building out a product. There's a lot of hypothesis that goes into it. Obviously, informed hypothesis is not based out of thin air, but still it's a hypothesis. And unless you try out and get that feedback loop working for you, you're not going to have that kind of success. And there's always going to be iteration. I think the definition of success keeps changing. I think it's a moving target in most cases, where tomorrow's success, probably day after tomorrow, it's going to be completely different. So to be able to have that feedback and pulse of the users, I think that is going to be very, very important for organizations to succeed. Which brings us to what are some of the lessons around people doing things horribly wrong? Some of the don't do's when it comes to, the API-led product growth space, especially in financial services, FinTech. What is it that you would tell people that they should definitely avoid? Do not do this. Whatever you do, do not do this. What would be some of those sort of lessons around this?
Sure. So I think one is, I think a lot of my answers are around product, because being a product manager, I'm a bit biased for those kind of answers here. But I think, it's with API teams, regardless of the organization, but especially if you're non-technical core product, it's make sure you don't get away from the end user and use cases. It's very easy to start building an API. It's very technical, and going down that rabbit hole that you want to avoid. It's not even premature optimization, which I think is another piece to avoid. Kind of goes hand in hand, but making sure that your solution actually is meaningful to the end user, and you're not just solving that one specific internal thing, and in a very elegant way, right? That you're keeping in mind the end user, the use case, and the organization at hand, and then just having that business sense around building those APIs of, well, where is it going to be used, and how is it going to be used, right? I've worked in my past implementing APIs in a place where there was really bad internet. So actually, you would expect that your APIs would fail more than half the time. So one of the goals is to get the payments in such a way that you have the least amount of API calls to complete it, because you have to basically chain them in such a way that making sure that it works. Otherwise, if you have 4 APIs, each of them with 50% chance of failure, you're having absolutely terrible experience. So you have to keep that in mind. You can have most high performance API, but the problem is not on your end. You have to understand where the problem is, and it's on, with the user. So that's just an example of considering those kind of things when building out a solution. Then I think the other component is I've kind of talked about premature optimization. Obviously scale is important, but you need to balance it against the use case, right? You don't want to go and, okay, how is this going to work across 100 million users or 10 million users if you still are struggling to get the first 10, right? So I think premature optimization is always like, oh, we can make this look amazing. It's gonna be lightning fast, but like great, but nobody's using it, especially if it's a net new product. I've definitely seen that a number of times. And then the one thing is security is important, but do not make it in such a way that it's impossible to use your API. So I think there's a lot of market standard solutions that are good. They're open. There's basically solutions that are standard and that people know how to use, right? So for one side, it's when a developer looks at it, okay, auth 2, I know how to use it. Maybe if it's MTLS, whatever, right? You know how to do it, but do not try to invent your own security mechanisms. I've definitely seen the cases where it's super secure, but it's basically impossible to get to the data. And it's like, oh, but no, it's so hard to get to. It's like, yeah, I'm as a trying to use it, this is impossible. So I think it's obviously you don't want to, I'm not saying don't be secure, you absolutely will have to be secure, but there's very smart people who've solved a lot of those problems. If you think you're creating something new and great, you could be, but most likely you're just blocking your clients from accessing your product. And that could be a very big, going back to the what to have. If you have a good stable demo and environment with data, right? Don't build a crazy InfoSec process around it that nobody can access, right? That time to hello world metric is a good one to measure it, because if nobody can figure out how to connect, yes, no hackers can do it, but also your clients can't do it. So
definitely, absolutely. I think there is that point around how secure is too secure and how little security is too little security. So I absolutely agree with you on that. One thing, just coming back to your experience as a product manager, there is a big element, because it's great to have a lot of these governance ideas and ideologies in place and good to haves and all of these things in place where you have security practices and planning and strategies and all of that, but it all needs to be tied in together. There needs to be that degree of collaboration across different teams within an organization to actually bring that to fruition, which is always challenging. The divide perhaps between the engineering side, perhaps a little bit between the business side and marketing, all of these teams need to work together, but you can see that they might be driven by different motivations, at least in their own silo sometimes. The objective obviously is to work towards a singular vision, but in a lot of times they're probably driven by different things. So as a product manager, how would you go about instilling a degree of collaboration that actually guides everyone across departments to work towards that common goal of achieving growth for a product or making a really successful product?
I think that's the role of a product manager, right? It's depending on each organization. Obviously, you want to foster collaboration, but I don't know if there's a silver bullet out there. If there is, I'm not aware of it. Obviously collaboration, but it depends on our organization. You have to do different things, right? Sometimes you're working more with the technical team. Sometimes you're more working with the marketing or with the finance, right? I think it really depends. It's about, I think that the key thing is spotting where you need to spend your time and spending your time there, right? And in different parts of my career, I spent with very different departments a lot of time. There was a time where I spent a lot as a sales enablement, because if the sales team doesn't understand what they're selling and why they're selling it, great, you can build the best product, although that was not product-led component, right? If you're more product-led, you need to spend with more outreach in the marketing side, so people are aware of it too a bit, right? It really depends on the thing, but the key skill there is to identify where you need to spend time, and not just doing what you've done in the past. Just because in your previous role, for example, you were very successful at doing X with this team, that doesn't mean that's what needs to happen here. Maybe it's a very different problem. On the surface, it may look the same, but it's actually stemming from a different area. So I think it's just being honest where you need to spend your time. And I think overall, the key thing there is just spending a lot of time with a lot of different teams and being a bit of an evangelist. Product manager is an evangelist of their own product, but just spending the time communicating. There was I remember years ago, there was one product launch, and my proud moment was I did a demo or some sort of a presentation of the product in that company to everybody except a receptionist and HR team. Everybody else, every other team in the company somehow got me to speak to them, right? And yeah, depending what you're trying to achieve, but usually, talking to more departments, making sure people understand why it's happening, and early enough too, right? So that they have the time to react. So it's not that at launch you're telling InfoSec, oh, by the way, we're launching this new API tomorrow, and then InfoSec is having not having a fun night about it. So just getting everybody aligned and working with them on because a lot of people have very different takes on it or experiences. They can contribute to it in many different ways, and sometimes more ways than you can expect. Just being open to experimentation around it.
All right, that's been great. We are at time now. So thank you so much, Daniil. That has been absolutely wonderful having a conversation with you. There's so many interesting and exciting nuggets around the world of financial services and what API-led product growth means. Just putting things into context of the different challenges that you experience just based off of the verticals and based off some of the objectives that are the motivating factors for organizations in this particular space. So thank you so much. It has been wonderful speaking with you. Hopefully you had a good time as well. And it's been great having you with us.
Thanks for having me. Cheers, guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening, everyone. Until next time, cheers and take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of All About APIs, powered by Tyke, a leading cloud-native API management platform for the modern stack. So come, empower your teams and put your devs in the driver's seat. If you want to find out more, visit us at tyke.io. And until next time, take good care of yourself.